A peaceful morning in the suburbs of Vermont. The morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of maple trees lining the quiet streets of Maplewood, a cozy suburban neighborhood nestled in the heart of Vermont. This idyllic little town with its white picket fences, barking dogs, and meticulously maintained front yards often felt like a picture pulled straight out of a children's storybook. It was a place where neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth, and children grew up basking in the safety of a close-knit community. Sophie Carter, a spirited 10-year-old girl known for her bright blue eyes and an ever-present green backpack, lived here with her family. She was a child of boundless imagination, prone to getting lost in her own world of sketches and colors. Sophie had a special affinity for drawing landscapes, and her favorite subject was her quaint neighborhood, complete with colorful birds perched on trees, cheerful gardens, and winding sidewalks that seemed endless in her eyes. That particular morning, September 15, 1995, Sophie woke up just as she always did, to the gentle, earthy aroma of her mother's coffee brewing in the kitchen. The house, built sometime in the 1940s, creaked softly as it welcomed the buzzing activities of a brand new day. The wooden floor was cool beneath Sophie's feet as she dashed down the hallway, the sunlight spilling through the windows illuminating her hurried steps. Her father, Jim, was lost in the day's newspaper, mumbling about something in the sports section. Her mother, Emily, bustled around the kitchen, lovingly preparing Sophie's favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwich for her lunchbox. "You'll want to remember this one when you're tired at school," Emily quipped as she handed Sophie the neatly wrapped lunch. Sophie giggled as she placed the sandwich into her bright green backpack, which was covered in pins and trinkets she had collected over the years, each one holding a little memory or story of its own. "Thanks, Mom," she said, planting a quick kiss on her mother's cheek before grabbing a cereal bar from the counter. The walk to her school bus stop was one of Sophie's favorite parts of her day. The distance wasn't far, just a few blocks down Maplewood Lane, but the journey was always filled with the simplest joys, spotting squirrels darting across the road, kicking up fallen autumn leaves in the soft breeze, and exchanging morning waves with Mrs. Hargrove, their elderly neighbor who loved working in her garden. On occasion, Sophie would find herself humming a tune, her sneakers tapping out a rhythm on the cracked sidewalk as she walked. This morning was particularly crisp, the scent of dew still hanging in the air, mingling with the faint smell of fireplaces left to burn overnight. Sophie wore her favorite yellow cardigan, slightly too big on her petite frame. "It'll keep you warm, sweetheart," her mother had reminded her before she left. She adjusted the straps of her backpack and took a deep breath, savoring the fresh Vermont air that always felt cleaner somehow. The school bus stop was just around the corner, marked by an old, rusty sign that had been there long before Sophie was even born. She arrived a little early, as she often did, and waited, watching leaves dance in the breeze. The sound of morning traffic was distant, a hum that added character but never chaos to their peaceful neighborhood. Though the Carter family led a modest life, Sophie felt like the luckiest girl in the world. A loving family, the freedom to explore her artistic side, and the serene rhythms of Maplewood. It was everything one could ask for. Life may have been predictable in this sleepy Vermont town, but there was a beauty in that predictability, a comfort that she never questioned. As the minutes ticked by, the faint rumble of the yellow school bus grew louder, signaling it was almost time to begin another day of learning and playing with friends. Sophie adjusted her cardigan one more time, brushing her bangs out of her face as the bus rounded the corner. She waved to the driver, always the friendly Mr. Jenkins, and cheerfully stepped aboard, her spark of youthful energy radiating as she walked down the aisle to find her usual seat beside her best friend, Lily. Unbeknownst to Sophie and the residents of Maplewood, this seemingly ordinary morning, with its pleasant routines and familiar tranquility, would take a catastrophic turn. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Sophie Carter's green backpack would be left untouched, her seat at the dinner table empty, and the small town's serenity would be broken by an overwhelming wave of confusion, fear, and heartbreak that would last for years to come. A sudden disappearance shakes the town. It started out like any ordinary day in the picturesque town of Maplewood. Families were waking up to another early autumn morning, with the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through homes and the golden light of the sun casting long shadows over neatly trimmed lawns. Sophie Carter, with her boundless energy and love of routine, had left the warmth of her home early that morning, her bright green backpack bouncing with every step. By all accounts, her walk to the school bus stop had been uneventful, or so it seemed. But when the school bus pulled onto Maplewood Lane that same afternoon to return the neighborhood children, Sophie wasn't among them, and as minutes turned to hours, concern turned to panic in the Carter household. Emily, Sophie's mother, made frantic phone calls to the school and to every friend Sophie could possibly have been with, only to find that no one had seen her since the morning. Her little girl, the one who never wandered, never caused anyone a moment of trouble, had vanished. By early evening, the Carters contacted the local police. Officers arrived quickly, asking dozens of questions, each one more troubling than the last. What was she wearing? Where was she last seen? Did she have plans to go anywhere after school? Could someone have been following her? The family's answers painted an innocent picture. Sophie had been wearing her favorite yellow cardigan, carrying her green backpack, and walking the same route she always had. No unusual vehicles, no suspicious people had been noticed. However, a neighbor 2 blocks down Maplewood Lane recalled something odd. A black pickup truck parked near the edge of the road that morning, idling just past the school bus stop. It hadn't drawn much attention at the time. Trucks were commonplace in this rural Vermont town, but looking back, the timing seemed unsettling. It was just sitting there for a while and then it drove off, the neighbor explained hesitantly to police. News of Sophie's disappearance spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. By midnight, word had reached nearly every household in Maplewood. Porch lights were turned on all throughout the neighborhood. Families opened their doors to police and volunteers, and flashlights dotted the streets as search parties combed through the nearby woods. The quiet, idyllic town was buzzing with urgency and fear, a stark contrast to the peaceful morning hours before. While the police worked tirelessly, their resources stretched thin. Vermont wasn't used to handling cases like this, and a missing child brought a level of scrutiny rarely seen in such a sleepy town. News stations picked up the story overnight, and by the following day, Sophie's picture-bright blue eyes, soft blonde hair, and a radiant smile was plastered on every screen and article across the state. "Sophie isn't the type to run away. She's only 10, Emily Carter tearfully explained to reporters. Her voice cracked, her hands clutching Sophie's stuffed rabbit, which the little girl had left on her bed. Her words echoed a sentiment shared by all who knew Sophie. This wasn't just some teenage rebellion or childish whim. Something was dreadfully wrong. The black pickup truck quickly became the center of the investigation. Multiple officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors and asking about the vehicle. Witness statements varied. Some claimed it was black, while others said it appeared dark gray or blue. One elderly man near the end of the street thought he'd seen a man sitting in the driver's seat, but his description was vague. He looked average, baseball cap, I think. Couldn't tell you much more. For the police, every piece of information was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, frustratingly out of order. As the days passed, the organized search efforts grew. Teams of volunteers scoured the nearby forest, calling out Sophie's name, their voices echoing through the tranquil Vermont woods. Trained dogs joined the search, sniffing along trails and creeks, but with no definitive results. Helicopters circled the area from above, their blades cutting through the silence, scanning for any sign of bright yellow fabric or a flash of green. Yet, hope began to waver as none of the efforts bore fruit. The longer Sophie remained missing, the more questions arose, questions that haunted her parents and the community. Was she still nearby, hidden in the dense thickets that surrounded Maplewood? Had she been taken across state lines, her captors using the quiet, empty highways to vanish into another world? Or worse, was Sophie even alive? These were thoughts no one dared to voice in the presence of Emily and Jim Carter, but they loomed heavily in every worried glance and whispered conversation. Emily, refusing to sit idly by, became a driving force behind the search for her daughter. She organized fundraisers to distribute flyers not just in Vermont but across neighboring states. Sophie's favorite color, green, inspired a wave of ribbons that residents tied around trees, fences, and mailboxes. Bring Sophie Home became a rallying cry for the town. School children painted posters, businesses offered rewards, and candlelight vigils were held nightly in Sophie's honor. Still, the days turned to weeks, and the initial avalanche of leads slowed to a trickle. Police drew up a rough sketch of the possible suspect based on scattered eyewitness accounts, but with no clear image or license plate number for the truck, they were stumbling in the dark. Despite the community's vigilance, Maplewood had little surveillance technology and far too many places for someone or something to disappear unnoticed. By the end of the first month, the absence of answers began to weigh heavily on everyone. The children in Maplewood started walking to school in groups, shepherded by concerned parents. Windows that were once left open on warm nights were now locked tight. The small town that had once seemed so carefree and secure now bore the scars of paranoia and fear. For Emily and Jim Carter, their world had shattered. Their home was buried in missing child posters, messages of hope from neighbors, and the crushing silence of Sophie's empty room. Her untouched toys and art supplies became painful reminders of her absence. Yet through their pain, one thing remained absolutely clear: they would never give up. Unbeknownst to the Carter family, their lives and the lives of every resident in Maplewood had been forever changed that morning. Sophie's sudden disappearance would not just test the love and perseverance of her family, it would expose long-standing flaws in law enforcement efforts, ignite a national conversation about child safety, and challenge the very fabric of trust in the quaint little town they called home. A community-wide search effort. The disappearance of Sophie Carter didn't just rattle her family, it sent shockwaves across the entire town of Maplewood. In a place where most everyone knew each other by name, and where trust was as abundant as the trees lining every street, the news of a missing 10-year-old girl was nothing short of a crisis. Strangers who passed each other with polite nods at the grocery store suddenly became allies, united by a cause: bringing Sophie home. The image of Sophie's bright blue eyes and infectious smile hung heavy in their minds, forcing action. The day after Sophie disappeared, Maplewood came alive with a kind of urgency it had never known before. Frantic calls flooded the police department, neighbors formed impromptu search parties, and handmade posters with Sophie's picture and details were tacked up on telephone poles, mailboxes, and store windows. Volunteers went door to door, asking the same heartbreaking questions over and over again. Have you seen her? Did you notice anything strange yesterday morning? Emily Carter, Sophie's mother, who was usually soft-spoken and reserved, transformed overnight into a relentless fighter. She stood at the town square with Sophie's picture in hand, speaking to anyone who would listen, sometimes choking on her words but always pushing through tears. "My daughter is out there," she told reporters during a hastily arranged press conference. "She's alive, and I need her to know that we won't stop looking for her, not for 1 second." Local businesses donated paper and ink to print thousands of missing person flyers, while teenagers from the local high school did the legwork of distributing them far and wide. The town's fire department provided their station as a coordination hub, where volunteers signed up for search shifts. Large maps of the area were spread out across tables with markers indicating areas that had already been combed for clues. But Maplewood wasn't the kind of town equipped for a search of this scale. It had no advanced surveillance systems and very few resources to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. Nevertheless, the community's determination filled the gaps. Farmers offered their trucks to carry supplies, hunters used their tracking skills to lead groups through the dense Vermont woods, and the town's 2 pastors organized round-the-clock prayer vigils attended by nearly everyone in the area. Church bells rang at noon that Friday, signaling the start of what became the largest multi-day search Maplewood had ever seen. Entire families participated, mothers bundled up their young children and marched down country paths, while fathers walked shoulder to shoulder with police officers through fields and streams. Flashlights cut through the shadows at dusk, and the sound of Sophie's name echoed through every hill and valley. The state police joined the efforts shortly after, bringing in trained dogs and helicopters to cover ground faster. Officers, dressed in their sharp uniforms, stood in stark contrast to the rugged flannel-clad volunteers, but they worked side by side with a shared purpose. Helicopters circled above the tree canopies, scanning for any sign of Sophie's yellow cardigan or her treasured green backpack. The media, both local and national, descended on Maplewood. The picturesque town became the backdrop for nightly news segments and live reporting. Reporters stood on the sidewalks holding microphones, their voices urgent as they recounted the latest updates. Sophie's face beamed out from televisions across the state and beyond. Calls from Good Samaritans poured in from as far away as New York and New Hampshire, though few provided actionable leads. The residents of Maplewood also took matters into their own hands in unique and heartfelt ways. Sophie's favorite color, green, became a symbol of hope. Ribbons were tied to fences, tree branches, and porch railings throughout town, a visual reminder of the community's commitment to bringing her home. The local elementary school, where Sophie was a 4th grader, organized a Hope Wall, where students wrote messages to Sophie on cutout leaves that were taped to a paper tree in the hallway. "Stay strong, Sophie. one little boy wrote in shaky cursive. "We'll find you soon," wrote another, accompanied by a drawing of Sophie wearing a cape like a superhero. Emily and Jim Carter, Sophie's father, fed off the energy of their town's support, though the grief hung heavy in their home. Sophie's bedroom remained untouched. Emily often got up in the middle of the night to sit on the edge of Sophie's bed, clutching her favorite teddy bear while staring blankly at her walls, plastered with drawings and posters of rainbows and animals. Meanwhile, doubts and whispers began to circulate as the days stretched on. A small but vocal group of skeptics questioned whether Sophie had been taken at all, or whether someone closer to the family might be involved. Rumors swirled about Emily and Jim, not maliciously, but fueled by desperation for answers. The police were forced to address these whispers in front of a growing throng of reporters, firmly stating that every possibility was being investigated. Despite the heartbreak, the residents of Maplewood refused to let their determination waver. Nights brought candlelight vigils in the town square, where hundreds of people gathered, their faces illuminated by the glow of dancing flames. Neighbors who might have never spoken before held hands, forming tight circles as they sang hymns and shared words of comfort. Above all, the search for Sophie brought with it an overwhelming display of unity, of people rising above their own fears and heartaches to take action. Ordinary citizens became heroes in their own right, overcoming doubts and exhaustion to walk mile after mile, to knock on doors, to sift through leaves, and to hold their neighbors close during moments of despair. As days turned into weeks, the hope that had carried the town in those early hours began to falter. The wooded areas surrounding Maplewood were less crowded now, with search teams growing thinner. Some volunteers' faces turned grim as the realization hit. Sophie could be anywhere. Vermont's winding roads and dense forests offered enough hiding places to swallow the truth forever. Yet for Emily Carter, giving up was not an option. Standing at the center of her town, flanked by volunteers and reporters, she made a promise that resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care if it's tomorrow, next year, or a decade from now. Sophie, I will find you, and I hope wherever you are, you know we're fighting for you." The Captor and the Darkest Days. Sophie Carter's disappearance sent shockwaves through Maplewood, but for her, the world as she knew it ended the moment she was forced into the back of a grimy black pickup truck. Her kidnapper, Marcus Walker, was a man whose hollow eyes and hard silence sent chills down her spine. At just 10 years old, Sophie didn't have the words to describe the raw terror that gripped her, yet she understood one thing clearly as Vermont's autumn landscape blurred outside the window: nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus Walker wasn't a stranger to violence. A middle-aged man with a criminal history that included sexual assault and attempted kidnapping, he had slipped through the cracks of a justice system that too often favored technicalities over accountability. Released on parole just 2 years before Sophie's abduction, Marcus had moved to a rundown shack at the edge of a dense forest in rural New Hampshire, a place so isolated it might as well have been erased from the map. The shack was nothing more than a crumbling one-story structure with peeling paint, and a roof patched together with old tarps and mismatched shingles. Behind the house was an overgrown yard littered with rusting debris, an old washing machine, tire rims, and tools swallowed by weeds. But it was what lay beneath the property that Sophie would come to know all too well. A cold, damp basement concealed by a hidden trapdoor under a threadbare rug in the living room. When Marcus dragged Sophie down into that darkness, her screams echoed off concrete walls that absorbed every ounce of her desperation. The basement was small and suffocating, illuminated by a single bare bulb that flickered ominously. There was a dirty mattress on the floor, a beat-up chair pushed against the wall, and nothing else. It was silent, save for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Sophie's first days in captivity were paralyzing in their terror and confusion. Marcus didn't speak to her much, instead exerting his control through unpredictable bursts of anger and manipulation. When he did speak, his voice was low and rough, each word laced with menace. "You're better off here," he sneered after Sophie begged to go home. "Out there the world's full of monsters. You're safer with me." At just 10 years old, Sophie couldn't understand the full meaning of his words. All she knew was that she was trapped, alone and utterly powerless. Days melted into nights, and nights stretched into what felt like eternity. Marcus controlled every aspect of her life, from when she was allowed to eat to when she could use the bathroom. Sophie, once a bright and vibrant child full of laughter, slowly learned to stay quiet, to make herself small, to avoid provoking the man who held her fate in his hands. Over the weeks that turned into months, Marcus began constructing an even more elaborate prison for Sophie. Using tools and materials scavenged from junkyards, he built a network of hidden spaces behind his home. There were makeshift sheds camouflaged by overgrown brush, a tiny trailer with its windows covered in aluminum foil, and even a reinforced soundproof room buried deeper into the property. To the outside world, Marcus appeared to be little more than a quiet loner, a man who kept to himself and rarely ventured far from his property. But behind the facade was a dangerous predator who had ensured Sophie would remain invisible. For Sophie, the isolation was unbearable. The basement became her world, cut off from light, laughter, and life itself. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly she lost all sense of time. The only respite came when Marcus, perhaps in an effort to convince himself he wasn't a monster, allowed her a small television. But even that came with rules. She could watch cartoons and family-friendly shows, ones that seemed to taunt her with visions of the life she'd once had but could no longer reach. Marcus's control extended to her very identity. He began to call her Lillian, forcing her to abandon even the familiarity of her own name. "Sophie doesn't exist anymore," he told her coldly one day. "Forget about her." Those words weighed on her, heavy with the horrifying realization that Marcus wasn't just trying to imprison her body, he sought to erase her entirely. Despite the suffocating fear, Sophie's spirit refused to completely extinguish. She clung to memories of her family, her mother's warm embrace when she scraped her knee, her father's habit of humming while reading the morning paper. She replayed the moment her mom tucked her favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwich into her lunchbox the morning she disappeared. These memories, though painful, kept her tethered to hope. Even in the darkness, Sophie found ways to hold on to her humanity. She began marking tiny scratches on the wall to count the days, though she later lost track. At one point, Marcus brought her crayons left over from some forgotten yard sale, perhaps as a twisted gesture of pseudo-kindness. To him it was a trivial token. To Sophie, it was salvation. Drawing became her lifeline. On torn scraps of paper and cardboard boxes, she sketched images of her family, her home, and rolling Vermont landscapes saturated with color, a stark contrast to the grayness of her reality. But any fleeting moments of peace provided by her drawings were always overshadowed by the oppressive presence of Marcus. His mood swings were erratic. One moment he acted as if he cared about her well-being, and the next, his rage would erupt without warning. Sophie learned to read his expressions, to anticipate his moods, and to avoid triggering his wrath. Survival became her every waking thought. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of her captivity was the psychological games Marcus played. He ensured her fear of the outside world matched her fear of him. "They'll never believe you," he'd whisper. "Even if you escape, they'll think you're crazy. You're safer here." Over time, those lies began to take root, and the possibility of freedom felt as distant as the stars glimmering faintly above her forgotten little prison. What Marcus underestimated, however, was Sophie's resilience. Beneath her fear and exhaustion was a quiet, unyielding strength. It wasn't visible, even to her, in those dark and endless days. But it was building, little by little, with every sketch she made, every memory she clung to, and every quiet moment she dedicated to imagining a better day. Little did she know, miles away, her family's fight for her had not wavered. While Marcus tried to bury Sophie in darkness, the love of her family remained a bright, burning light that refused to be extinguished. The early years of captivity. Sophie Carter's early years in captivity were defined by a profound, all-consuming darkness. Not just the literal absence of light in the cold basement where she was held, but also the suffocating, oppressive fear that sank into her bones. Time itself became a shapeless void as days bled into nights, and the once brilliant spark of a vibrant, artistic 10-year-old seemed to dim, flickering precariously against the unrelenting cruelty of her reality. The basement served as Sophie's entire world in prison. It was damp and freezing most of the year, with walls of cracked concrete that wept moisture whenever it rained. The bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that played tricks on her mind. Marcus Walker, her captor, had left a lumpy, stained mattress in the corner of the room for her to sleep on, along with a single tattered blanket. The emptiness of her surroundings only amplified her loneliness, a void of comfort, affection, and life. It wasn't just a prison for her body, but a calculated attempt to crush her soul. In those early days, Sophie fought against despair. She screamed until her throat was raw, hoping someone might hear her through the thick walls of her underground cell. She kicked the locked door at the top of the basement stairs until her legs throbbed with pain, But the only response was the distant sound of Marcus's voice, cold and detached. "No one's coming, you're wasting your breath." His words echoed in her mind long after he'd retreated, filling her young heart with a gut-wrenching mix of frustration and hopelessness. Food was rationed carelessly in the beginning. Sometimes she'd go a day or two without eating, only to finally receive scraps or sandwiches hastily tossed down the stairs. Marcus seemed to enjoy the power imbalance, watching from above as Sophie hesitantly crept toward the plate, always wary of his presence. He would study her reactions, a faint smirk crossing his face. "You see, Lillian," he told her during one of those moments, "the world out there doesn't care about girls like you, but I do." He had started calling her Lillian almost immediately, a calculated move to erase her identity and instill in her the belief that Sophie Carter no longer existed. For the first few weeks Sophie refused to respond to the name. She clung tightly to her sense of self, replaying moments of her life before the abduction like a broken record in her mind. Her mother's smile as she handed over a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, her father's warm laugh as he fumbled with the sports section of the paper, the feeling of autumn leaves crunching beneath her sneakers. These memories became her defiance, her proof that Sophie Carter was still alive and mattered. But Marcus was relentless. He controlled every aspect of her day, deciding when she could eat, sleep, or even speak. Punishments were swift and frightening: a slammed door, withheld meals, or the threat of being locked in an even darker, smaller closet within the basement, kept Sophie in a constant state of alert terror. Over time, the part of her that screamed and smashed against the walls began to quiet. The fight didn't leave her entirely, but the will to survive took precedence. She learned to anticipate his moods and follow his rules, shrinking herself into something small and unobtrusive. In the absence of time markers like calendars or clocks, Sophie began to lose track of the days. The seasons, once a source of joy and inspiration for her drawings, no longer existed. The only tangible proof of time passing came from the faint sounds she could hear from above: the plink of rain against the roof, the chirp of birds that seemed to mock her captivity, and occasionally, the distant rumble of passing cars that reminded her of the free world she had been ripped away from. Marcus rarely spoke at length, but when he did, his words were often manipulative and cruel. Slowly but deliberately he tried to break Sophie's connection to reality. "Do you know what happens to girls who leave?" he would ask, his voice almost conversational but laced with menace. "They never make it. The world eats them alive. But you're safe here. Maybe one day you'll understand." At just 10 years old, Sophie couldn't fully process his lies, but they seeped into her subconscious nonetheless, planting seeds of doubt that she fought hard to uproot. Every so often Marcus would feign kindness, bringing her small objects to make her captivity feel less bleak: a worn book with pages missing, crayons from a thrift store, or an old, grainy television set that barely worked. Each object came with strings attached. The book could be taken away if she misstepped, the television could be unplugged as punishment. Even the crayons, though mundane in Marcus's eyes, were riddled with significance for Sophie. With their bright, imperfect hues they became her lifeline. On scraps of cardboard, torn paper bags, and anything else she could find, Sophie began to draw. She sketched her family, their smiling faces etched from memory, her mother's kind eyes, and her father's signature cap. She drew her old neighborhood, the tall maple trees and the streets she had walked every day. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a way to remind herself of the life she had before Marcus. Though Sophie tried to cling to hope, the weight of isolation was suffocating. The sound of her own voice, once confident and bright, now felt foreign to her. Sometimes she would whisper her name, Sophie, just to ensure she hadn't forgotten it, as Marcus insisted she do. She would mouth her parents' names as if speaking them into existence could somehow bridge the gap between them. As the months turned into years, Sophie learned how to navigate life in captivity. It wasn't defeat, it was survival. She learned how to decipher Marcus's shifting moods, recognizing the signs of his calm moments versus those tinged with danger. She became strategic, acquiescing when necessary and retreating into her mind when things grew too overwhelming. It was a fragile existence, but it was enough to keep her alive. Deep down, even in her darkest moments, Sophie believed in a sliver of hope. She held on to the thought that someone, her mother, her father, her neighbors, was still looking for her. Though her connection to the world outside was severed, she imagined her name being spoken aloud in prayers and whispered through the streets of Maplewood. That thought, small yet powerful, became the ember she would stoke to keep her spirit alive. Unbeknownst to Sophie, that ember would one day ignite into something she had nearly forgotten, the fierce determination to be free. Finding hope in the darkness. As years passed in captivity, Sophie Carter learned to navigate the oppressive confines of her existence. The basement, with its suffocating darkness and walls that seemed to close in tighter with each passing month, had long ago stripped her of the concept of time. Yet something miraculous happened in that bleak void. Sophie's resilience began to take root, not as a thunderous defiance but as a quiet, unyielding force that refused to let her spirit die. The raw shock and terror of her early days with Marcus Walker had faded, replaced by a numbing monotony punctuated by occasional bursts of fear. She had learned how to avoid his ire, how to calculate his moods, and when to shrink into silence to avoid punishment. But what Marcus failed to anticipate was Sophie's ability to find slivers of light in the tiniest cracks, even in a world designed to crush her. Her journey to find hope didn't come quickly or easily. It started with the small television Marcus had allowed her to keep, a rare concession he'd granted either out of guilt or his warped sense of control. The television, its screen streaky and sound crackling, played reruns of old cartoons and family sitcoms. For Sophie, it became a portal to a world she could no longer reach but still dreamed of. She would sit cross-legged in front of the screen, watching animated characters laugh and play, their carefree lives a far cry from the damp gray space she was trapped in. At first, it hurt to watch. Seeing children run through golden fields, families gathering for meals, and friends laughing together felt like salt in a wound that refused to heal. But slowly those scenes began to spark something fragile and essential inside her. Instead of mourning what she'd lost, Sophie began to imagine herself back in those moments. She pictured herself running through sunny meadows, swinging on a backyard tire swing and sitting around her family's dining table as her mom poured orange juice and her dad told his corny dad jokes. These daydreams became her escape, her private sanctuary where Marcus couldn't reach her. One particularly crisp autumn morning, as the faint sound of rustling leaves drifted through a small basement vent, Sophie pulled out the crayons Marcus had once given her, a seemingly insignificant gesture but one that became her salvation. On a piece of torn cardboard she began to draw. Her first attempt was shaky, her hands trembling as if she were using muscles she hadn't flexed in years. Her lines were uneven and the colors didn't quite stay within the borders she intended, but none of that mattered. Slowly, an image took shape. A house bathed in golden sunlight surrounded by tall, swaying trees. It was her home. As Sophie filled in the details, the curtains she remembered from the kitchen window, the maple tree in the front yard, the little birdhouse her dad had nailed to the side of the garage, she was overcome with a mix of emotions. Joy, longing, and pain all swirled together. But for the first time in years, so did something else. Hope. Her drawings became a lifeline, a way to tether herself to the world she had left behind and perhaps to a future where she might see it again. Day after day, Sophie continued to draw. When Marcus left her alone for hours at a time, she would spread out her makeshift canvas, a mix of torn brown paper bags and scraps of cardboard, and create her own universe. She drew her parents, her mom's soft smile, her dad's baseball cap. She recreated scenes from their backyard, imagining herself chasing fireflies on a warm Vermont summer evening. She even drew Maplewood Lane, the winding sidewalk she used to walk every morning, complete with little stick figures representing her neighbors. What Marcus saw as a harmless pastime, Sophie treated as an act of rebellion. With every line and splash of color, she refused to let Marcus erase who she was. Instead, she preserved herself in these images, pouring everything she remembered and everything she longed for into her art. The act of creating became a powerful tool for survival. It gave Sophie something to look forward to, a reason to get through another day. Even as Marcus's mood swings continued to threaten her fragile peace, she held on to her drawings as tightly as she did her memories. Sometimes, late at night when Marcus was asleep and the house was eerily quiet, Sophie would whisper to herself. She'd say her name, Sophie Carter, reminding herself that she hadn't disappeared no matter how much Marcus insisted she had. One night, while staring at the ceiling and clutching a small, crumpled drawing of a sunflower field she had created, Sophie made a quiet but monumental decision. She would survive. Not just physically but emotionally and mentally. Marcus could keep her locked in the basement, take away her voice and her freedom, but he couldn't take her will to live. In that moment she realized her hope didn't have to be a loud, blazing fire. It could exist as a faint ember, glowing just bright enough to keep her going. Occasionally Marcus would let down his guard, likely believing that Sophie had accepted her fate. During these rare moments, Sophie seized any opportunity to observe the world beyond her prison. She listened closely when he forgot to close the door upstairs, cataloging the sounds of birdsong or passing cars. Once, when he left a magazine within her reach, she carefully unfolded its pages, her eyes scanning headlines and images that reminded her that the world outside still existed. These stolen glimpses gave Sophie an anchor. They reminded her that something bigger awaited her beyond the four walls of the basement. She began to plan, not with deliberate intention, but with quiet determination. Every noise she heard, every detail she saw, every word Marcus uttered, it all became part of an intricate web of information she hoped to use someday. Though Sophie's days remained dark and uncertain, she had managed to carve out a space inside herself that Marcus could never reach. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a spark of light that illuminated her path forward, no matter how distant freedom seemed. And with every day that passed, that spark grew stronger. The Carter family never gave up. While Sophie languished in a cold, dark basement far removed from the life she'd once known, her family's world had come crashing down the moment she didn't step off the school bus that afternoon. But amid the heartbreak, shock, and endless questions, one thing became clear to Emily and Jim Carter. They would never stop searching for Sophie. Time could pass, leads could dry up, but the Carter family refused to let hope die. At first, the days after Sophie's disappearance were a blur of chaos and desperation. Emily couldn't sleep. She stayed awake through the nights, pacing the living room as tears endlessly streaked down her cheeks. Her hands shook as she dialed phone numbers, repeating the same questions to friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Did anyone see anything? Did anyone notice something unusual? In the quiet moments, when no one was there to answer, all she could do was hold Sophie's favorite stuffed bunny and sob quietly into its worn fabric. Jim, a man who rarely let emotions overcome him, struggled to keep it together. He spent every waking minute organizing search parties with neighbors, walking mile after mile through Vermont's dense woods, calling Sophie's name until his voice was hoarse. He refused to let himself rest. "If she's out there," he told Emily, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief, "I'm not going to stop until I hold her in my arms again." But days turned to weeks, and soon weeks turned into months. A harsh reality that would have broken even the strongest families, not the Carters. Where others saw the growing gap in time as a barrier, Sophie's parents saw only one option. They had to fight harder. Emily Carter, once a reserved and soft-spoken woman who rarely stepped outside her quiet suburban bubble, transformed into a fierce advocate for her missing daughter. She poured her grief into action, founding a non-profit organization called Bring Sophie Home. Initially created to raise funds for Sophie's continued search, the non-profit grew into something much larger. Emily began advocating for families of missing children across Vermont and beyond, helping them navigate the painful maze of investigations and bureaucracy. The nonprofit became a lifeline for families seeking answers. Emily used her story to inspire hope and foster attention on missing persons cases that often faded into obscurity. She spoke at candlelight vigils, donated proceeds from fundraisers to search and rescue organizations, and worked tirelessly to keep her daughter's name alive in the public sphere. "If we stop talking about Sophie, the world stops looking for her," Emily said one cold January evening during a public event. The Vermont winter made her words visible in white puffs of breath as she addressed the crowd. "I won't let her story fade. I won't let her be forgotten. My daughter deserves to come home." Jim found his strength in action. Hands-on, methodical, and relentless, he left no stone unturned. He became an expert in search and rescue tactics, poring over maps with a precision that would rival any trained professional. Jim partnered with local and state law enforcement agencies regularly but also worked independently, pressing them to re-examine clues and leads they'd set aside. He spent weekends interviewing retired detectives and researchers, learning about methods for tracking missing persons. His garage walls became a sprawling command center covered with maps, pinned photographs of Sophie, and timelines documenting every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. The Carter family also relied on their community for support. Despite the passage of time, the people of Maplewood refused to let Sophie's case become another footnote of heartbreak. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, the town hosted a candlelight vigil. Old friends and strangers alike turned up to honor Sophie and keep her story alive. Each year they tied green ribbons, the color Sophie had loved most, around trees and mailboxes. For the Carters, these gestures were a reminder that they weren't alone in their fight, even when despair loomed over their home. Emily and Jim's efforts weren't without challenges. There were moments of unimaginable pain when leads fell apart or false hope brought crashing disappointment. A tip about a possible sighting in Connecticut turned out to be wrong, just a girl who looked like Sophie walking with her family at a busy mall. Another dead end arrived when someone claimed to have information about a black pickup truck, only to be seeking reward money with no real knowledge of the case. The hardships extended beyond false leads. With each passing year, the pressure to move on grew heavier. Well-meaning friends and even extended family members occasionally encouraged the Carters to stop clinging to hope. Maybe it's time to start healing, one relative suggested at Thanksgiving years after Sophie's disappearance. Emily's face hardened as she set down her fork. "I'll heal when I have my daughter back under this roof. Until then, I will not move on." Her tone left no room for argument. For their youngest daughter, Lucy Carter, Sophie's absence was a constant shadow growing up. Just 5 years old when her older sister disappeared, Lucy's memories of Sophie became blurry as she grew older, but her parents never let Sophie become a forgotten story, reminding Lucy always to feel Sophie's presence even if she couldn't see her. In time, Lucy joined her parents in their mission. As a teenager, she created a social media campaign to amplify Sophie's story to a new generation. Videos, images, and updates on the campaign were shared widely, reviving attention on the case each time it began to fade. Emily and Jim's unwavering hope wasn't blind. They knew the odds were growing slimmer with every passing year, but their love for Sophie overcame the cold logic of statistics. "Some people may think we're foolish," Jim admitted during a television interview, "but faith is all we have. Faith in our daughter. Faith that somewhere, somehow, she's still out there, waiting for us to bring her home." The Carters' love for Sophie stretched across years and miles. Their determination shaped laws in Vermont, leading to wider reforms in missing persons investigations. Their advocacy ensured that cases like Sophie's didn't fall through the cracks. But for them, nothing mattered more than the moment they would finally hug their daughter again. Unbeknownst to Emily and Jim, their relentless love and determination were rippling out far beyond their small, grieving family. The community had rallied behind them. Strangers across state lines carried Sophie's picture in their wallets, while truck drivers volunteered to keep an eye out for the black pickup mentioned in early reports. Faith was contagious, and the Carters' fight gave others a reason to hope. In the midst of it all, Emily clung to a quiet prayer she whispered every night before bed, as she sat on the edge of Sophie's still-made bed, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. "Wherever you are, we're coming. You hold on. We're fighting for you." More than a decade later, Sophie would learn this truth. Her family never wavered. Through every discouraging lead and every silent night, the foundation of their strength, the unassailable bond of love, became the beacon that ultimately kept her going even when she felt like giving up. Their love transcended the walls of her prison, reaching her through the darkest of days. The investigation rekindled after years. By 2008, 13 long years had stretched between Sophie Carter's disappearance and the present day, yet her case still loomed over Maplewood like a heavy cloud that never dissipated. For her parents, Jim and Emily Carter, the years felt both impossibly slow and heartbreakingly fast, a blur of hope, despair, and an unrelenting fight to keep Sophie's story alive. But as time passed, the search had grown colder. Leads had run dry, search efforts had inevitably quieted, and the public's attention had shifted toward new headlines. At the FBI field office in Burlington, Vermont, Sophie's name remained etched on the metaphorical cold case wall, a haunting reminder of unresolved pain. For most law enforcement officers, it had become a file-gathering dust, one of many nearly forgotten tragedies. But for one young agent, Sarah Mitchell, Sophie's case became an obsession that reignited the flame of hope. Agent Mitchell, ambitious and driven by a strong sense of justice, stumbled upon Sophie's case while combing through archival files as part of a routine review of cold cases in the region. She was relatively new to the Bureau, green in the eyes of some of her colleagues, but her sharp instincts and relentless curiosity made her stand out. As she read through the details of Sophie's disappearance, something began to gnaw at her, a realization that perhaps a crucial thread in the investigation had been missed. "It just doesn't add up," she would later tell her supervisor. "The timing, the location of that truck sighting, the dismissed reports from that neighbor a few blocks down, it's like no one connected the dots." Her curiosity quickly turned to urgency as she began re-examining the witness statements from 1995, particularly those involving the mysterious black pickup truck that had been spotted near Sophie's bus stop the morning she disappeared. One witness, Mrs. Harper, a widowed retiree who lived 2 streets over, had initially told police she'd seen the truck parked oddly near the edge of the woods on the day Sophie vanished. However, her testimony had been dismissed, as she couldn't recall specific details like a license plate number. Agent Mitchell visited Mrs. Harper personally, hoping that the passage of time hadn't erased her memories completely. To Sarah's surprise, the elderly woman remembered more than anyone had assumed. "I told the officers back then," Mrs. Harper said sharply, "that it wasn't just sitting there. I saw it leave. It turned toward Route 47 heading out of town, and there was someone in the passenger seat. I couldn't see the person clearly, but it wasn't an adult." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A potential passenger, Sophie? Had this detail been ignored for over a decade? "Did the officers ever follow up with you about that?" Sarah asked carefully. Mrs. Harper shook her head. "No, they told me it didn't lead anywhere and that I shouldn't worry myself." Back at the office, Sarah combed through additional records and cross-referenced every reported sighting of black pickup trucks in Vermont between 1995 and 1996. The process was tedious, the database incomplete, but what stood out to her was Marcus Walker's name, an individual whose prior criminal history included attempted abduction and assault. Walker was already a person of interest in several other states, but had never been seriously investigated in relation to Sophie's case. Digging further, Sarah discovered that Marcus had been living just 40 miles north of Maplewood at the time Sophie disappeared. He owned a black pickup truck that matched witness descriptions. It was registered under his name during the mid-90s, but he'd sold it years later. Police had questioned him as part of another case, but never tied him to Sophie's disappearance beyond cursory logistical checks. "It fell through the cracks," Sarah realized bitterly, her frustration mounting. Armed with this new information, Sarah pushed her superiors to reopen the case. At first there was resistance. After all, the original investigation had exhausted significant resources, and cold cases often required a miracle to reignite. "It's been over a decade," one senior agent had pointed out during a meeting. "We followed every lead. What makes this different now?" But Sarah wasn't deterred. "Because we didn't connect everything the first time," she argued passionately. "Because Sophie deserves better, and because Walker is still out there." She backed up her claims with a detailed timeline, showing suspicious gaps in Walker's documented whereabouts at the time of the abduction, alongside statements from witnesses that hadn't been thoroughly pursued. Her determination finally paid off, and the Bureau agreed to devote resources to revisit the case. "We're not promising miracles," her supervisor, Agent Daniels, warned. "But if you think there's a valid lead here, you have exactly 6 weeks to prove it." With the clock ticking, Sarah assembled a small but capable task force to track Marcus Walker and piece together his movements over the years. They dug into his work history, personal relationships, and property records. What they found was chilling. Marcus had moved repeatedly throughout New England, often to remote, isolated locations. He had a history of keeping to himself, as neighbors and landlords described it, rarely engaging with the communities around him. More troubling, Marcus had purchased a small dilapidated property in New Hampshire shortly after Sophie's disappearance. It was situated on a dense, overgrown piece of land, far from any major roads or towns, a perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to stay out of sight. Undercover surveillance of the property revealed little at first. Marcus had grown older, quieter, and appeared to be nothing more than a hermit living off the grid. But Sarah's instincts told her this wasn't just some eccentric recluse. His behavior was calculated, and the eerie silence surrounding the property spoke volumes. "He's hiding something," she told her team during a late-night briefing. Weeks later, the break they had been waiting for came when they obtained a warrant to search the property. It wasn't easy. They needed cause to convince a judge that this wasn't just a hunch. The combination of Walker's past activities, the witness statements linking him to Sophie's disappearance, and his erratic history finally gave them the legal avenue they needed. On a cold gray morning in March, heavily armed FBI agents descended on Marcus Walker's rural home, their black SUVs tearing through the underbrush as their team moved into position. Sarah was among them, her pulse racing as she prepared to confront a man she had only known through case files and mugshots. The raid began quietly, meticulously. There was no room for mistakes. The FBI entered the property and began their sweep. What they found beneath his house would change everything. The miraculous rescue. 13 years after Sophie Carter vanished without a trace, a quiet morning in New Hampshire turned into a day that would forever be remembered by the agents, officers, and community fighting to bring her home. For Agent Sarah Mitchell and her team, it was the culmination of endless hours of digging through cold, fragmented case files, eyewitness reports, and Marcus Walker's haunting criminal history. On March 10, 2008, the FBI descended on Marcus's remote property with everything they had, the hope of finding Sophie and the weight of years of unanswered questions driving them forward. The weather that day reflected the gravity of the situation. Cold gray clouds hung low over the forest, the trees bare and skeletal in the late winter landscape. The sound of snapping twigs and crackling radios broke the dead silence in the woods as Sarah's team approached, their faces tense with a mix of focus and apprehension. The black SUVs were parked a safe distance away, hidden from view, as agents crept toward the run-down house that had been Marcus Walker's sanctuary, his fortress, for more than a decade. The house itself was almost surreal in how unremarkable it seemed, just a ramshackle structure built of crumbling wood, with tarps hastily tacked over parts of the roof. Old furniture and rusting appliances littered the yard alongside jagged scraps of metal and piles of debris. It looked abandoned, lifeless, yet there was something deeply sinister about the quiet. Sarah's gut told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just another dead end. He was here, and so was Sophie. "Move in quietly," Agent Daniels whispered through the radio, his voice calm but firm. "No sudden noises. We don't know what we're walking into or how he'll react." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat. She'd spent weeks piecing together the puzzle that had led them here. Every step felt like a lifetime. As the tactical team encircled the property, she stayed close behind, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. She wasn't sure what was about to happen, if they would find Sophie alive or if they were too late. But she refused to let fear distract her from their mission. When the team breached the front door, the old wooden frame splintered with a loud crash. The house was eerily quiet save for the hum of the agent's movements. Flashlights sliced through the dimly lit interior as the team spread out, covering every corner of the decrepit space. Rotting floorboards creaked underfoot. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air, along with something faintly metallic that made Sarah's stomach churn. "Clear upstairs," one agent reported over the radio. "No sign of anyone." Sarah stopped in front of a worn rug in the middle of the living room floor, noticing how out of place it seemed amid the disorder. The edges of the rug were uneven, frayed in places where the fabric didn't quite sit flat against the floor. Her breath caught as she knelt down and yanked the rug back, revealing a trap door with a rusted handle. She didn't wait for backup. She knew this was it. Every instinct in her body pushed her forward. "Got something here!" she called out, adrenaline surging through her veins. The trapdoor was heavy, but together with another agent, Sarah managed to pull it open. What lay beneath was a steep staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit them first, a mixture of damp earth, mold, and something faintly human. Flashlights illuminated the space below, revealing concrete walls and a makeshift basement that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. They called out his name, their voices echoing in the underground space. "Marcus Walker, FBI, come out with your hands up!" The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the entire world had stopped, their breaths held collectively as they waited for any sound, any indication of life below. Marcus didn't make it easy. He was backed into a corner now, and men like him didn't surrender without a fight. Moments later, he emerged from the shadows on the far side of the basement, his face pale and defiant. His hands were raised, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He didn't say a word as agents moved in to restrain him. Marcus Walker was finally caught, but Sarah's focus wasn't on him anymore. "Search the basement!" she shouted. As they swept the space, Sarah's flashlight landed on a small, confined area near the back of the basement. The sight stopped her in her tracks. There, sitting hunched on a dirty mattress, was a young woman who barely looked real. Her blonde hair hung limp around her face, her frame painfully thin, her eyes wide and hollow with exhaustion and fear. She flinched at the beam of the light, instinctively drawing her knees up to her chest, as though she still wasn't sure if she should trust what was happening. Sophie. The air seemed to leave Sarah's lungs. "Sophie," she whispered, careful not to move too quickly. She crouched down, making herself smaller, trying not to startle her. "Sophie, it's okay. We're here to take you home." The young woman blinked at her as if trying to process the words. There were tears in her eyes now, spilling silently down her cheeks, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Sarah's voice cracked with emotion as she reached out her hand. "You're safe now, we're going to take care of you." When Sophie took her hand, Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes. It was the gentlest touch, but it carried the weight of 1,000 prayers finally answered. Sophie Carter, the little girl who had been stolen from her family and her future, was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. As Sophie was guided out of the basement and into the crisp open air, sunlight struck her face for the first time in over a decade. It was blinding, but it was beautiful. She shielded her eyes as the sky above came into view, her world expanding from the darkness of one man's cruelty to the limitless possibility of freedom. The scene outside the house was a flurry of movement, agents securing the perimeter, medics rushing to Sophie's side, Sarah standing by, her heart still hammering with disbelief and relief. Sophie looked frail and fragile, but there was a spark in her eyes that told Sarah one thing: Sophie Carter had fought to survive, and she had won. When news of Sophie's rescue spread, it sent shockwaves across the country. The little girl who had been stolen from Vermont had been found, a miracle in every sense of the word. For her parents, Jim and Emily Carter, the moment they saw Sophie stepping out of that black SUV at the hospital was nothing short of divine. Their daughter, their baby, was alive. The years of heartache and unanswered prayers evaporated the moment they held her in their arms again. "You're home!" Emily sobbed, clutching Sophie tightly. "You're finally home!" The world changed, but family love remained unbroken. When Sophie Carter stepped out of the darkness and into the embrace of her family, the world she had left behind 13 years earlier was almost unrecognizable. For a decade and more, Sophie's life had been frozen in time within the confines of Marcus Walker's basement. But outside, the world had continued to turn, evolving in ways Sophie could barely begin to comprehend. Yet one thing remained steadfast, a comforting anchor in the ever-shifting sea of time: the unwavering love of her family. For Sophie, that first night back in her parents' home was surreal. The house looked both familiar and foreign, as though she had stepped into a dream of her childhood. The walls were painted the same soft yellow she remembered, but there were new photographs on the mantel, pictures of her sister Lucy growing older, celebrating milestones Sophie had missed. Lucy, now a young woman instead of the wide-eyed child Sophie remembered, stood nervously at the edge of the room, unsure how to bridge the distance that time had wrought. Emily and Jim Carter never let Sophie out of their sight that night. Emily busied herself in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she whipped up Sophie's favorite meal, macaroni and cheese, the kind she used to ask for every birthday. The smell wafted through the house, and for the first time in years it felt alive again. Jim set the table with an almost ceremonial care, placing napkins and silverware with the precision of a man trying to hold back tears. When Sophie sat down at the table, the room fell silent for a moment. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers, but the heavy, emotional pause of a family trying to process the miracle in front of them. Emily reached across the table, taking Sophie's hand in hers. "You're home," she said softly, her voice breaking. "No matter how much the world has changed, this hasn't." But reintegration was far from easy. While the Carters were overjoyed to have Sophie back, they quickly realized that the years of captivity had left marks deeper than the physical. Sophie was no longer the bright-eyed 10-year-old who had raced out the front door with a green backpack, ready to conquer the world. She was now a young woman with scars, some visible, some hidden, who had spent more than half her life as a captive. The outside world was a sensory overload for Sophie. The glaring lights of supermarkets, the constant hum of traffic, and the strange, ever-present beeps and tones of smartphones all felt foreign and overwhelming. She marveled at the flat, sleek devices everyone carried in their pockets. Technology seemed almost magical to someone who had last seen a world running on VHS tapes and bulky desktop computers. "Wait," Sophie had asked one day, holding Lucy's smartphone and poking hesitantly at the screen. "You're telling me you don't need a computer to send an email anymore?" Lucy had smiled and handed Sophie earbuds, letting her scroll through YouTube videos of kittens and music Sophie had never heard before. It was the first time the sisters had laughed together, breaking through the initial awkwardness that had kept them apart. Jim and Emily knew they had to be patient as Sophie navigated her new reality. There were days when seemingly simple things, like choosing a loaf of bread at the grocery store, reduced her to tears. The sheer variety, the endless options, highlighted just how much of her freedom had been stolen. "I don't know which one's normal," she whispered once in frustration, holding up 2 identical loaves. Jim gently took her hand and said, "Whatever one you pick is fine. You don't have to get it all perfect." Therapy became a cornerstone of Sophie's recovery. Emily found a counselor who specialized in trauma and worked tirelessly to create a safe space for Sophie to unpack the years of pain, fear, and confusion. At first, Sophie was hesitant, unsure if she could ever put into words what had happened to her. But slowly, brick by brick, the walls she had built around herself began to come down. She started sharing pieces of her past, sometimes a memory, sometimes just a single word that lingered in the air like a weight removed from her chest. The Carters created new routines that respected what Sophie needed. Family dinners became sacred, a time to reconnect and show Sophie she was never alone. Sunday afternoons were spent walking through the quiet streets of Maplewood, Sophie's way of reclaiming the town that had once been her safe haven. Emily scoured Vermont for art supplies, giving Sophie a way to tap into the creativity that had been her lifeline during captivity. The drawings Sophie produced were vivid, emotional, and haunting, capturing both the joy of freedom and the lingering shadows of her time in the dark. For her younger sister Lucy, the process of connecting with Sophie was bittersweet. She had idolized Sophie as a child, remembering her as the big sister who could turn anything into an adventure. Now, standing face to face with Sophie as a grown woman, Lucy felt an immense responsibility to bridge the years they had lost. She dedicated herself to helping Sophie navigate the modern world, teaching her how to use apps, introducing her to new music, and sharing stories of what Sophie had missed in the years she was gone. "It's like you've been frozen in time," Lucy said one night as they sat on Sophie's bed, scrolling through a playlist Lucy had created. "But now you're here, and we're going to figure all this out together." Sophie smiled, squeezing Lucy's hand. "Thank you for not forgetting me," she whispered. Despite the challenges, the Carters refused to let Sophie's circumstances define her. They held on to the belief that she was more than what had been done to her. Slowly but surely, Sophie began to believe it too. She started accompanying Emily to community events, even standing alongside her mother at a fundraiser to support missing person efforts. Her voice, quiet but steady, spoke directly to the audience. "I'm proof that no matter how long it takes, love will always find its way back to you." The world outside may have moved forward without her, but Sophie discovered that her family's love had created a bridge between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. The Carters didn't try to erase the years, it was impossible, but they showed Sophie that those years didn't have to define her future. On the first anniversary of her rescue, Sophie stood in the Maplewood town square for the annual candlelight vigil that had once been held in her absence. The glow of hundreds of candles illuminated the faces of friends, neighbors, and strangers who had never stopped searching for her. Sophie lit the final candle, her hands steady as she held the flame to the wick. Looking out at the crowd, she saw her parents, her sister, and the town that had kept her memory alive. For the first time in years, Sophie felt whole, like the missing pieces of her life were slowly finding their way back to her. The world had changed, but the love that Sophie returned to, that fierce, unconditional family love, was the one thing that had never wavered. It was her anchor, her foundation, and the light that guided her home. Facing justice. After 13 years of terror and captivity, Marcus Walker was finally in custody. The man who had stolen Sophie Carter's childhood was no longer a shadow lurking in the dark. He was someone the world could see, someone who would now answer for his crimes in the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. But for Sophie and her family, facing justice was not just about the courtroom. It was about reclaiming their lives, finding closure, and beginning a new chapter after over a decade lost to fear. In the weeks following Marcus's arrest, the story captivated the nation. News outlets replayed the harrowing details of the rescue and described Marcus Walker as the embodiment of evil, a man who had evaded accountability for far too long. Old mugshots of him filled television screens and internet headlines, his hollow eyes and cold expression reinforcing the public's image of him as a monster. For the Carter family, those images were both a relief, proof that he could no longer harm anyone, and a painful reminder of the years he had taken from them. The trial, held in Vermont's capital under heavy security, drew widespread attention. Cameras lined the courthouse steps every morning, capturing every arrival, every statement. Reporters speculated endlessly about the defense's strategy and how the prosecution would present Sophie's testimony. For Sophie, the decision to testify was one of the hardest choices she had ever made. Facing the man who had controlled every aspect of her life for 13 years was a nightmare she had long tried to suppress. But deep down, she knew the trial wasn't just about holding Marcus accountable, it was about reclaiming her voice. "Sophie will support you no matter what," Emily had told her the night before Sophie made the decision. They were sitting in the living room together, the glow of the fireplace flickering across Sophie's face. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, but if you want to tell your story, if you want to face him, we'll be there, every step of the way." Sophie nodded slowly, her hands trembling as they gripped her mother's. "I have to do this," she whispered. "Not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt. He doesn't get to walk away from this." The trial began in late June, and the courtroom was packed. The audience included Sophie's family, FBI agents who had worked tirelessly to find her, and even strangers who had followed her story and come to support her. On the defense side sat Marcus, his face emotionless and unsettlingly calm, wearing a cheap suit that didn't disguise the menace beneath his demeanor. His lawyer argued that Marcus suffered from mental illness, framing his crimes as the actions of a man disconnected from reality. Their attempts to garner sympathy were met with disgust by the prosecution and Sophie's family. For Sophie, being in the same room as Marcus felt like stepping back into the basement she had fought so hard to escape. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had her family, her legal team, and the supportive presence of everyone in the courtroom who believed in her. When it was time for her to take the stand, her steps were steady, her chin held high despite the unease swirling in her stomach. The courtroom fell silent as Sophie began to speak, her voice steady though it wavered at times with emotion. "For 13 years I was a prisoner in a nightmare," she told the jury. "I was taken from my family, stripped of everything I loved, and told every day that I didn't matter, that no one was coming for me, that I'd never see the sunlight again. But here I am now, and I want everyone to know that no matter what he did to me, he didn't win. I'm still here. I'm standing here today because of the people who never gave up on me." Her testimony lasted hours, with the defense attempting to undermine her credibility by pointing to gaps in her memory or suggesting she had been manipulated into exaggerating her story. But Sophie's calm, unwavering responses left no doubt in anyone's mind. She described the horrors of the basement, Marcus's manipulative tactics, and the quiet hope she clung to through her art and memories of her family. At one point, she locked eyes with Marcus as she described the isolation he had forced her into. He looked away first. The prosecution, led by a sharp and tenacious district attorney, painted Marcus as a predator who had meticulously planned Sophie's abduction and captivity. They brought in witnesses who testified about his disturbing behavior before Sophie's disappearance, neighbors who remembered the black pickup truck idling near schools, former co-workers who recalled his erratic temper. Key evidence from the FBI's raid was presented, including items recovered from Marcus's property, the trapdoor to the basement, the makeshift locks he had installed, and sketches Sophie had drawn while in captivity. Each piece of evidence was a reminder of the darkness Marcus had inflicted, but also of Sophie's resilience. The defense's attempts to humanize Marcus faltered under the weight of the evidence against him. Their arguments about his mental state were undone by their own witnesses. Psychiatrists called to the stand who conceded under cross-examination that Marcus was aware of his actions and their consequences. Marcus himself remained silent throughout the trial, refusing to testify, but his chilling lack of remorse only further solidified the jury's perception of him. After weeks of emotional testimony and meticulous arguments, the courtroom awaited the jury's verdict. For the Carter family, the hours felt like years. Emily held Sophie's hand tightly, while Jim sat beside them, his jaw clenched as he stared at the floor. When the jury returned, the air in the room felt electric, charged with anticipation. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Walker, guilty on all counts." The room erupted in a mix of quiet sobs and murmurs of relief. Sophie's head fell into her hands as tears streamed down her face, not tears of despair, but of release. Marcus Walker was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never harm another soul again. He was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his fate a stark contrast to the freedom Sophie had fought so hard to reclaim. For Sophie, the verdict was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of her journey. "Justice doesn't erase what happened," she explained in an interview months later, "but it gives me peace knowing he can never do this to anyone else, and that peace is something I didn't think I'd ever feel again." The trial not only held Marcus accountable, but also reignited a national conversation about how the justice system handles cases involving dangerous repeat offenders. Sophie's case highlighted the need for reform, and Emily Carter became a leading voice in advocating for stricter laws to monitor individuals with histories of violent behavior. Her nonprofit, Bring Sophie Home, expanded its mission to support other survivors of abduction and abuse while calling for systemic change. Ultimately, Marcus Walker's trial and conviction were more than just the conclusion of a criminal case. They were a testament to the power of resilience, love, and a community's refusal to give up. They symbolized Sophie's courage in reclaiming her story and facing the darkness head-on. And for the Carters, it was proof that justice, though delayed, could still be served. The journey of healing and giving back. When Sophie Carter was rescued after 13 harrowing years of captivity, her freedom was just the first step in a long and complex journey toward healing. The physical chains that had bound her were gone, but their echoes remained, in her memories, her soul, and the way she faced the world. The path forward was not easy, but her resilience proved unwavering. Sophie's story was about more than survival. It was about turning unimaginable pain into purpose. The initial days after her rescue were a whirlwind of overwhelming emotions, medical evaluations, and media attention. Doctors assessed her frail body, noting the malnutrition, the scars on her wrists, and the toll that years of isolation had taken on her health. Physically she was free, but in many ways the walls of Marcus Walker's basement followed her as she stepped back into the world. Sophie's first battles were the quiet, invisible ones, facing the lingering trauma of her years in captivity. She struggled to feel safe, to trust the people around her. The sound of doors shutting still sent chills down her spine, and unfamiliar men made her instinctively shrink inward. Sleep came in restless bursts, disrupted by nightmares that blurred the line between memory and fear. Sophie often woke drenched in sweat, her hands trembling as she reached out reflexively for the barred walls of the basement she had called home for too long. But Sophie wasn't fighting alone. Her family, Jim, Emily, and her younger sister Lucy, became her steadfast anchors in the storm. Emily, in particular, poured every ounce of her grief and determination into helping Sophie heal. "We've worked so hard to bring you home," Emily told her one quiet night as Sophie sat on the porch staring out into the trees. "Now we'll work just as hard to help you feel whole again." Therapy became a cornerstone of Sophie's recovery. Emily and Jim sought out trauma specialists who had experience working with abuse survivors, giving Sophie a safe space to process her pain. At first, Sophie was hesitant, unsure she could ever put into words what she had experienced, but her therapist, Dr. Rachel Monroe, approached her with patience and kindness, never pushing too hard. "When you're ready to talk," Dr. Monroe told Sophie, "I'm here. When you're not ready, that's okay too. We'll sit with that silence." Sophie appreciated the dignity she was given, and slowly, brick by brick, she began dismantling the heavy walls she had built around herself. Art, too, became part of her healing. During her years in captivity, drawing had been Sophie's quiet act of rebellion, a way to hold on to pieces of the life she had loved. Now, as she sat in the sunlight with a fresh set of paints and brushes, it became something entirely new, a means to rebuild. Her first paintings captured the pain she carried with her, the dim light of the basement, the cracked concrete walls, the weight of silence. But over time, the colors grew brighter. Sophie began painting memories she wanted to cherish: golden Vermont sunsets, the smiling faces of her parents, the vibrant green ribbon her sister tied in her hair the day she came home. Each brushstroke felt like a step forward, each completed painting a triumph. Her artwork became her voice before she fully found the courage to speak. Shortly after sharing them with her therapist, Dr. Monroe encouraged Sophie to exhibit her drawings anonymously at a local gallery's charity event. To Sophie's surprise, her pieces resonated deeply with others. People left notes behind, thanking the unknown artist for showing them the strength to face their own pain. Sophie read each note in tears. It was the first time she realized that sharing her story, whether through art, words, or actions, could make a difference. The turning point came when Emily was invited to speak at a national conference for families of missing and exploited children. Up until that moment, Sophie had shied away from the spotlight, hesitant to be seen as a victim. But that day, as she sat in the audience listening to her mother recount the years they had spent fighting for her return, Sophie felt a surge of something new, the need to take control of her own narrative. When the conference organizers passed a microphone to Sophie, she hesitated only briefly before standing. "I spent 13 years in a basement," her voice was soft but steady, "and for 13 years, darkness was all I had. But I'm here to tell you that even in the darkest moments there was something inside me that refused to give up. It was my family's love that pushed me to keep going, even when I wanted to disappear. I realized something important. We can heal. We can take all the broken pieces and put them together again. And when we do, it's not just for ourselves, it's for everyone who's still trapped in the dark." From that moment on, Sophie's journey became a mission. She found strength in advocacy, joining her mother's nonprofit Bring Sophie Home and helping it grow into a national organization that supports survivors of abduction and raises awareness about child exploitation. She worked tirelessly to lobby for reforms in missing person investigations, advocating for better resources and training for law enforcement. Sophie's story became a rallying cry for change, her bravery inspiring others to demand justice and protection for vulnerable children. Sophie also began visiting schools, speaking to young people about resilience and hope. She would hold up one of her old drawings, a childlike sketch of a maple tree surrounded by sunlight, and tell the students, "This drawing helped me survive. You don't have to be an artist to fight through hard times. Hold on to what sparks joy for you, even when everything feels impossible." Her public appearances resonated beyond survivors and their families. Sophie's voice brought communities together, reminding them of the power of collective action. Candlelight vigils that were once held for her now became gatherings to honor all victims, lighting the way for others who were still waiting to come home. Despite her growing public role, Sophie remained humble, often retreating to the quiet solitude of her art when the weight of her advocacy became too much. "I'm not a hero," she said in an interview years later. "I'm just someone who lived through something terrible and wanted to make sure no one else ever has to. That's my purpose now." On the 10th anniversary of her rescue, Sophie published her memoir, 13 Years of Silence. Laid bare in its pages was the full story of her abduction, survival, and eventual freedom. The book was haunting yet hopeful, a testament to the human will to overcome the unimaginable. Critics praised it for its honesty, and readers connected deeply with her message of resilience. Proceeds from the book were donated to organizations supporting missing and exploited children, a gesture that further solidified Sophie's legacy of giving back. Today, Sophie Carter's name is synonymous with survival, strength, and advocacy. She has rebuilt her life piece by piece, crafting not only a future for herself but also hope for countless others. Through her tireless work, she has shown the world that even the most fractured souls can heal, and that love, especially the unwavering love of a family, is the foundation of that healing.